Hello and welcome back to Cult Leader. I'm your cult leader, Spencer Henry. And today, we're discussing a cold case murder sent in by a cult babe that reads like it could be a conclave part 2. So buckle up, because this one's got it all. We've got mystery, we've got scandal, and a small town vibe straight out of Twin Peaks. It seemed like a regular morning on March 4th of 1998 at St. Michael Catholic Church in Dane, Wisconsin. Parish school teacher Brian Jackson, 24 at the time, rolled up around 7:09 a.m., ready to start his day like usual. But his morning routine took a sharp left turn when he peered through the door windows and saw something sprawled across the hallway floor. At first he thought maybe it was a student pulling a prank, or maybe someone who had slipped. He really didn't know what was going on. Once inside, Jackson realized, oh shit, it was Father Alfred Coons, face down in a massive pool of blood, right at the foot of a statue of St. Michael the Archangel. You know, the one who's supposed to protect you from evil. Jackson did what any normal person would do. He panicked. He dropped his bags, he ran over and tried to check for a heartbeat, but Kunz was cold and stiff. Frantic, he bolted to the principal's office and called 911, running back and forth between the phone and Kunz's body as the dispatcher gave him instructions. And that's when the full-on horror set in. Jackson, understandably freaking out, started dropping F-bombs left and right, yelling into the phone. There's so much fucking blood, I don't know where it's coming from. In a last-ditch attempt to help, he rolled Kunz over to perform CPR, and that's when he saw it. Kunz's throat was slit so deeply, he was nearly decapitated. Jackson, now officially losing it, screamed into the phone, I think somebody's murdered him. I suppose I'm a suspect. Yeah, which is maybe not the best thing to say when you're covered in blood and on the phone with 911. Waunakee EMS pulled up 4 minutes later at 7:13 a.m., with EMTs Vaughn Fry, Shirley Nelson, and Robert Bernards arriving to see Jackson, hands stained with blood, motioning for them to come in while making a slashing gesture across his throat. Basically, the universal sign for it's bad. But before they could enter, Lieutenant Ludwig, who was monitoring the radio call, told them to stay put until law enforcement arrived and was able to secure the scene. Meanwhile, Jackson kept repeating poor Father Coons and asking if they could pray for him, and EMTs later confirmed that by the time Jackson found him, Coons had already been dead for hours. Emergency room experts determined that Coons could have only survived for about 1 minute after the attack, meaning that even if EMS had arrived sooner, it would not have made a difference. I mean, considering the gravity of the injury, almost decapitated. Less than 2 minutes later, Deputy David Kadanak arrived as the first cop on the scene. Walking into the school hallway was like stepping onto the set of Dexter. Blood was everywhere, smeared across the floors, lockers, walls. It was clear that there had been a brutal struggle. Kunz's knuckles were bruised, a sign that he had fought back and hard, which was not surprising. Despite his priestly duties, the guy was once a Golden Gloves boxer and still had the build of someone you wouldn't want to mess with. But in the end, none of it was enough to save him. By this point, things were spiraling into full-blown chaos. Teachers arriving for work jumped into action, herding students away from the school and over to the local fire department, where the day's classes were promptly canceled. Parishioners and curious townsfolk gathered at the municipal garage and town hall, eager for answers. So many people, so many questions, and no answers. Investigators wasted no time launching a full-scale operation. Within hours, 20 to 30 detectives were knocking on doors, questioning literally everyone in the small town of less than 800 people. Neighbors, parishioners, former students, even the guy who fixed the church's boiler. But from the very beginning, solving Father Kunz's murder felt like trying to find the last piece of a jigsaw puzzle in the dark. There was no weapon, no witnesses, no easy answers. What investigators did learn pretty quickly was that Father Alfred Coons wasn't just another small-town priest, okay? He was a polarizing figure who people either adored or, well, not so much. Born on April 15th, 1930, in the tiny town of Stitzer, Wisconsin, Kunz was raised in nearby Fenimore in a deeply devout Catholic household. His parents, Swiss immigrants, ran a small Depression-era cheese factory in their basement, which, if you think about it, it's peak Wisconsin behavior. Despite tough times, they instilled in their 8 children a deep faith, a strong work ethic, and a sense of generosity that seemed almost over the top. Case in point. There's this story that Kunz's father once gave away their entire Christmas, tree and all, to their struggling neighbors because they had nothing. Sweet, right? But also, was this a heartwarming act of charity, or was Papa Kunz just done with the holiday stress and decided to offload it all? Imagine the trauma of coming home, no tree, and dad's just standing there well, we gave it away, kids, offer it up. Anyway, regardless of intent, it stuck with young Alfred. The Coons family attended daily mass because, well, of course they did. It was there that Alfred's unwavering devotion to the church took root. But his call to the priesthood didn't come in some divine beam of light moment, no prophecy. It came after a near-fatal appendectomy when he was just a kid. So back in the day, they used ether as anesthesia, and basically you were knocked out and just kind of tripping balls. And when Alfred came to, he had a revelation. He turned to his mother and declared, "I want to be a priest." And just like that, his lifelong path was set. Kunz went all in. He enrolled at the Pontifical College Josephinum in Ohio, where they train priests like it's boot camp, and after 12 grueling years of study, he was ordained in 1956. His first mass was held at his childhood church, St. Mary's in Fenimore, where it all began. After his ordination, he bounced around a few Wisconsin parishes, building up a reputation for being a no-nonsense, old-school kind of priest. And then, in 1967, he landed the top job at St. Michael Church in Dane, and that's where things really get interesting. Kunz was known for his ultra-simple lifestyle. He took no salary, drove old beat-up cars, none of that flashy Rome stuff, and basically lived with the bare essentials. Minimalism before it was cool. If you were looking for Kunz, you'd be just as likely to find him flipping cod at the church's legendary Friday fish fries as you would leading mass. He fixed cars for struggling families, showed up at hospital bedsides at all hours, and even made time to celebrate mass at his mom's house on her birthday every single year. He's like an Eric Camden from Seventh Heaven if Eric Camden was a real person and not a gross actor child abuser. In 1974, when literal lightning struck St. Michael Church and burned it to the ground, Kunz didn't just sit around and pray for a miracle. He rolled up his sleeves and led the charge to rebuild the entire church. His congregation rallied around him because if there was one thing about Kunz, it was that he got things done. Some people saw Kunz as a saint of sorts. He was selfless, tireless, always showing up for the biggest moments in their lives. Marriages, baptisms, funerals, you name it. He was their teacher, their priest, and for better or worse, a lifelong presence in their community. Others, well, they weren't exactly fans, okay? His hardcore old-school views on Catholic doctrine didn't always sit well with the more progressive crowd. Communion in the hand? Not on his watch. You see, Kunz had a complicated relationship with the Catholic Church. On one hand, he remained obedient to his diocese, advising priests and bishops across the country on things like the prophecies of Fatima, a series of Marian apparitions that, depending on who you ask, were either divine messages or the original Catholic doomsday predictions. He even had a private morning prayer session with Pope John Paul II at the Vatican, which is basically like getting invited to brunch with royalty if you're Catholic. But on the other hand, Kunz was also an unapologetic rebel in a Roman collar. Most priests were rolling with the changes brought on by the Vatican in the 1960s, like holding mass in the local language instead of exclusively Latin, and more relaxed services, and Kunz initially went along with it. He even rocked plaid vestments and let folk music creep into his services. And it's like, okay, cool guy. I mean, not bright eyes, but you get the picture. But after a while, he did a full 180, rejecting the modern reforms and doubling down on the old school traditions, which makes sense since he reportedly modeled his priesthood after the teachings of St. Paul. And if you don't know, St. Paul's vibe was basically, I'm not just Christian, I'm super Christian. And he wanted everyone to be just as committed as he was. He wrote most of the New Testament. Anyway, Father Kunz's hill to die on, the traditional Latin Mass. Kunz insisted on celebrating it despite not having official authorization, and guess what? People loved it. He built up a devoted following from across the Midwest, attracting hardcore traditionalists who wanted their mass the way Grandma had it. In Latin, with incense so thick you could choke on it, baby. We've got candles, we've got organ music, we've got robes. St. Michael's, under Kunz's leadership, became a refuge for those that were longing for the pre-Vatican II days. But his take on Catholicism wasn't just retro, it was hardline. He believed sending kids to public school was a sin, thought the church was way too soft on issues like divorce, and he was very outspoken against homosexuality. If you were looking for a priest with progressive vibes, Kunz was not your guy, okay? Kunz's stance on receiving communion in the hand, the body of Christ, hard no. To him, it was practically a gateway drug to disbelief in the real presence of Christ. He thought it was a slippery slope straight to sacrilege, and he wasn't shy about telling people they were playing with fire. Eternal fire. And his controversial decisions weren't just limited to theology. But I do have to pause really quick. So my mom had a cousin, and his name was Paul, actually. I believe he's still with us. Super nice guy always, but I remember when we were kids, we went to church for some reason, because my family was not Catholic, but we went to a Catholic church, and they offered communion, and I took the little wafer thing, and I remember he was like, no, oh my God, like just totally freaked out, because he's like, you're not supposed to do that, but I wanted it because other people were having it. So that's my story. That's all there is to it. But it made an impression. I mean, adult me remembers, and I barely remember anything. All right, back to the story. In the 1980s, Kunz made waves when he dismissed the parish council and forced the nuns out of St. Michael's. Why? Apparently, they didn't see eye to eye on the direction of the parish school. It was literally his way or the highway. Kunz never wavered in his mission to uphold Catholic teachings, no matter how extreme it seemed to outsiders. His rigid orthodoxy made him a hero to some and a villain to others. There was no middle ground with Kunz. You were either all in or all out. Take, for example, the time he conducted a public funeral for an aborted fetus. Yes, you heard that right. Kunz not only held a service, but he also buried the tiny casket at the foot of a Fatima statue outside St. Michael's. He named the baby Raphael, and allegedly, it was all done at the request of the grieving mother. Even among Catholics, this was a lot. Some saw it as a powerful pro-life statement, while others were left scratching their heads, wondering if it was perhaps a step too far. Needless to say, it made people uncomfortable on all sides of it. But Kunz, he knew exactly what he was doing. He was stirring the pot. He was making headlines, and he was sticking to his guns. A woman named Mora Smith, who was a waitress at a local diner, had a pretty wild take on Kunz's dedication. She claimed the father would wait for it, dumpster dive for fetuses to bury. So yeah, let that sink in. And the craziest part, she loved him for it. To her, it was proof of how far he'd go to uphold his beliefs, no matter how disturbing it might seem to, well, literally anybody else who would hear, read, see anything about that. Mora is, well, a bit of a character, okay? Picture a tough, no-nonsense, ex-military, ex-law enforcement, single mom in the 90s, okay? No one's fucking with Mora. After her divorce, she moved to Wisconsin hoping to find work in her field, but life had other plans. And when the job offers didn't exactly pour in, she ended up waiting tables at a local diner, and that's how she met Father Kunz. One morning, as Mora served him breakfast, she did what any good waitress does. She complimented his Latin-style bolero hat. Because, let's be honest, how often do you see a priest rocking one of those? Kunz, ever the evangelist, took it as an opening. He asked if she was Catholic, which, classic Kunz, and next thing she knew, she was getting an invitation to church. According to Mora, they became really close, and she saw him as a father figure, beyond just being, well, a father figure. But hold that thought. We'll get back to her soon. So when he wasn't performing questionable burials, like dumpster diving for fetuses, I can't, or tending to his parishioners, or rocking his iconic hat, Kunz was making waves in Catholic media. He co-hosted the Our Catholic Family radio show with attorney Peter Kelly, and let's just say it wasn't exactly feel-good content, okay? This wasn't your typical love thy neighbor Catholic talk. Kunz served up fire and brimstone, baby. He laid down the law on Catholic teachings and the supposed dangers of straying from tradition. And he wasn't shy about calling out the church hierarchy either. Let's just say some of his hot takes didn't exactly win him a lot of friends among the clergy. Now here's where things start to get a little eerie. On March 3rd, 1998, my 7th birthday, the night before his body was found, Kunz spent the evening doing what he did best. He talked to his flock. He had driven about 70 miles to Monroe with his best friend and confidant, Father Charles Fiore, to tape the latest installment of the radio show, but there was a twist. This was going to be Kunz's last episode. Kunz was pushing for Fiore to take over the show, and honestly, Fiore was a natural. The guy had the voice, the knowledge, and the drive to keep it going. But something felt off about this departure. Father Charles later recalled that on the way home, he tried to break the silence with Kunz. He said, "Al, you've been a good friend." And Kunz's response was a simple, "I know." And that was it. They spent the rest of the drive in silence. There was no deep heart-to-hearts, no emotional goodbyes, just a quiet ride back to St. Michael's, Kunz's final ride home. By around 10 p.m., Kunz was back at the church. He let himself into his small apartment, cranked the radio to full volume, reportedly because he was hard of hearing, and popped in a microwave pasta meal into the microwave. It was just a regular Tuesday night for him. And then, at 10:22 p.m., he made a quick phone call to another priest, which was nothing unusual, just some church business that needed to get taken care of. From the crime scene details, we know what happened next. Pants unbuckled, shoes off, finished meal container nearby, keyring in hand. Everything pointed to him settling in for the night. But sometime after 10:30 p.m., things took a dark turn. And this brings us back to the following morning, when Brian Jackson walked into the hallway, spotted the body, made that chilling 911 call, where he blurted out, "I suppose I'm a suspect." Spoiler alert, he was absolutely right. The person who finds the body and calls it in is almost always suspect number one. It's like Detective 101. Brian was quickly hauled in for questioning. But get this, Dane, Wisconsin is so small, they don't even have a sheriff's station. So we got grilled at the local firehouse because that's the only other building in town, I guess. But I want to talk about Father Kunz and Brian Jackson's relationship. They didn't exactly get along, but I wouldn't be convinced it was motive enough to slit someone's throat ear to ear. That's pretty hardcore. Reports suggest that Kunz had his issues with Jackson mostly over school policies and duties. Basically, Kunz saw him as nothing more than a glorified hall monitor, and let's just say he wasn't a fan of Brian Jackson's charm. Even though, according to Detective Don Johnson, one of the first detectives on the case, Jackson was a real hunk of burnin' love. Her words, not mine. But Kunz, he wasn't feeling the same love. In fact, Kunz found Jackson frustrating, seeing him as a distraction to the women teachers at St. Michael's. I mean, he must have had their panties in a twist. There's some scandal here. The other beef between them was that Jackson and fellow teacher Heather Godejohn had butted heads with Kunz over missing a parish event for a night at the opera. Apparently, Kunz was upset that they thought the opera was more important than serving prime rib at the Eucharistic Day dinner, and he did not approve. If we're looking for a motive, I guess that's something. Thou shalt never ditch my church dinner or whatever. But here's where things get extra. After Kunz's murder, Jackson moved into the mansion of Kunz's bestie, Father Charles Fiore. And Fiore wasn't your typical priest. This guy was rich. We're talking family oil, gas money, and he lived in this massive estate on a hill called Monte Cristo. Yeah, like the Count of Monte Cristo, but with more crucifixes and less revenge plotting, allegedly. But why did Jackson move in? Well, for one, his arrangement with Father Kunz wasn't exactly your standard payroll setup. Kunz never actually paid him a salary. Instead, Brian got something more like an allowance, room, board, and a little spending money. So maybe after the murder, Fiore stepped in to just, help him out. Or maybe things were a little more than just friendship. Let's put it this way. Investigators found some interesting stuff in Fiore's nightstand, including a photo of Jackson in a loosely tied robe. Friendly? Sure. Weird? Maybe. There was also a picture of the two of them chilling on the terrace of Fiore's bedroom. Now, before we start tossing around accusations of circle jerks and whatnot, Let's keep it factual, okay? This isn't Real Housewives. Jackson always maintained that he's straight, and for what it's worth, I believe he was married with a wife as of 2019. But fast forward to the forensic side of things. Investigators found partial DNA at the crime scene. Sounds promising, right? Well, not so fast. Scientists couldn't determine when it got there, which is a bit of a buzzkill. But they're pretty confident that the sample was most likely left by the killer. So the theory goes that the brutal struggle before Kunz's death probably led to some DNA getting left behind, be it spit, blood, whatever, some sort of fluid. And since it's only a partial sample, they have to have a suspect to compare it to. It gets real sciencey and convoluted at that point. I'm just a dumb bitch with a microphone. I'm here to tell the story, not here to break that down for you. Well, Brian Jackson's DNA did not match, and the 911 call analysis didn't flag much besides Jackson's overwhelmed rambling and squealing. The only slightly sketchy part of the call was the way he kept saying there's so much blood I don't know where it's coming from. Some investigators thought it sounded really rehearsed, but honestly, he was probably just speaking his thoughts out loud in a full panic. I mean, who wouldn't? But it didn't stop investigators, especially one in particular, and that is Detective Kevin Hughes, who was placed on the case after Don Johnson was taken off after 2 years. He remained 100% convinced that Brian Jackson was the killer of Father Alfred Coons. Like, we're talking tunnel vision, okay? Eventually, Hughes got so frustrated with the case that he packed his bags and moved to Ecuador. And as for Fiore, well, he passed away in 2003, taking whatever secrets he might have had with him. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with a weird setup, some suspicious photos, and a whole lot of unanswered questions. Who could have done this, and why? Dane, Wisconsin was the kind of place where people didn't lock their doors. They often didn't even think about it. A violent crime here of all places, and in a church? That was next level shocking. At first, the cops even thought it might have been a robbery gone wrong, but here's the weird thing. Nothing appeared to be stolen. And when officers got to the scene, they found some of Kunz's belongings, his key ring, shoes, necklace, all placed neatly beside him. Almost too neat, like someone wanted them found that way. The church collection money was untouched, and there weren't any obvious signs of forced entry, so naturally the question became, did Father Coons know his killer? I guess he was known for leaving the church unlocked so anyone could come in and pray if they felt compelled, but the church and school were connected by a long hallway, and the school part where Coons had his small apartment was always locked at night. So what made him leave his apartment and go into the hallway? What or who was he looking for? There were scratches and paint chips on the ground near one of the doors, but investigators had no way of knowing if these paint chips were recent or if they were left over from something else. I mean, this building had been there for a long time. Some people think they were connected to a break-in that had happened a few weeks earlier. Apparently, Father Coons had been hearing strange noises around the church at night and mentioned it to a few people, saying that he was trying to figure out what was going on. He had also been complaining about missing checks. So, was he worried someone was sneaking in to steal? Coons wasn't exactly the most organized guy. He had a well-known habit of stashing large amounts of cash in plastic bags under his desk. Which, like, come on, Father, get a safe already. Some investigators thought that maybe someone knew about this and tried to rob him, but then things escalated and, well, led to what we know happened. Plus, there had been reports of church burglaries in the area at the time where religious artifacts were disappearing from other churches around this same time period. So was Father Coons just in the wrong place at the wrong time, or was this something more personal? According to John Kavanaugh, a retired sheriff's deputy, his nephew Joseph Kavanaugh did it, telling investigators, yeah, I think my nephew did it. According to his uncle, Joe confessed that he had gone to Coons asking for money, and when Coons refused, Joe supposedly said he had to rough him up. And Joe has a wild backstory. He was adopted along with his 2 siblings by a strict Catholic family. He had a traumatic childhood, including sexual abuse by an older man, which he never told his adoptive parents about, and carried the secret for years. At 17, Joe lied about his age to enlist in the army. He got stationed in Germany and came back just a totally different person. His crime spree kicked off shortly after, starting with burglary and assault, and he ended up with a rap sheet that could fill a novel. including a history of sexual assault and violent tendencies. Kavanaugh was convicted of sexual assault after smashing a woman over the head with a wine bottle and attacking her. Just absolutely vile, total fuck ass. He claimed he'd found religion afterward, but that didn't stop him from bouncing through 3 marriages, fathering 5 kids, and failing to hold down a job. Oh, and did I mention the high-speed chase in his red Mustang? I mean, it's just the quintessential, oh, I've gave my life to the Lord, so forgive me for everything. I'm not that person. I guess he's the perfect suspect, but where was Joe the night of the murder? That's the real question here, right? Well, according to police records, Joe was staying with his sister about 10 miles away from St. Michael's the night before Kunz's murder. But, and it's a big but, his alibi wasn't airtight. His sister initially backed up his story, but later after their divorce, his ex-wife confessed to investigators that Joe had forced her to lie about his whereabouts that night. She even said she was afraid for her life. Despite this, police couldn't pin it on Joe. In 2002, after getting arrested for kidnapping and sexually assaulting an ex-girlfriend, Joe hanged himself in his jail cell. R.I.P., I guess. To make sure they weren't missing anything, authorities tested his DNA posthumously, but it didn't match anything found at the crime scene. Still, Joe's uncle, John Kavanaugh, swears it was him. But without that solid forensic link, police had to keep looking, and that's where even more suspects and more wild theories started pouring in. Some people believe Father Kunz's deep dive into exorcisms and his outspoken fight against the forces of evil made him a target. A target for individuals dabbling in the dark arts. Yeah, we're talking about Satanist again. Okay, I told you Kunz wasn't just your average parish priest. He had lore. He had a reputation for tackling the big stuff, like the literal devil. Reports suggest he performed exorcisms and spoke openly about Satan's growing influence within the church. And according to some of his followers, his murder had a few ritualistic tones. Like, his body was found right at the foot of a statue of Saint Michael the Archangel, the ultimate demon-slaying saint. Is it a coincidence? Some people don't think so. But here's the catch. Despite his reputation, Kunz wasn't actually an official exorcist. He wasn't sanctioned by the church to do exorcisms, but in true rogue style, he learned them from none other than Malachi Martin. And if you don't know who Malachi Martin is, he's basically the high priest of Catholic conspiracy theories. He was born in Ireland, and he was a Jesuit priest turned author who claimed to have inside knowledge of a satanic cabal infiltrating the church. He left the priesthood in 1965 and wrote several controversial books about demonic possession and corruption in high places, and he lived in a place he called Windswept House, also the name of one of his books, where a character, loosely based on Kunz's BFF, Father Fiore, fights evil forces within the Vatican. Martin was convinced that Kunz was murdered by Luciferians. According to Malachi, Kunz had been targeted for his work in exorcisms, and his killer was even part of a larger conspiracy. Martin even went so far as to say that Kunz had performed many exorcisms and had powerful enemies because of it. And get this, Martin himself died under kind of weird circumstances. He claimed he was pushed down the stairs by a demon, just wild, and later died from a brain bleed, so, take that how you will. Also lending to this theory is that almost exactly 24 hours before Father Kunz was killed, sheriff's deputies responded to a bizarre call. A mutilated calf was found just down the road from St. Michael's, and if you've ever gone down a satanic panic rabbit hole or listened to an episode of this show, you know animal mutilation is often linked to occult activity. Some locals whispered that the two incidents were connected. Was the calf a warning of sorts? Part of a ritual in the murder of Father Kunz? But here's the thing. Police officially ruled out any ritualistic elements in the crime scene. There was no creepy symbols, no candles, no weird stuff, except the scene itself. To them, it was a plain and simple case of murder, not some satanic sacrifice. But still, Kunz's friends, including Martin, weren't buying it. One of Kunz's ties to the fringe elements of Catholicism was his connection to the Society of St. Pius X, SSPX. SSPX is a traditionalist Catholic group that really didn't like the Vatican's modern reforms, and apparently just before Father Kunz was killed, Bishop Richard Williamson, a member of SSPX, referred someone to Kunz for an exorcism. So naturally, police looked into it and questioned Williamson, but ultimately there was no smoking gun, just a lot of rumors and whispers that Coons knew something he wasn't supposed to know. Was Father Coons murdered because he was about to blow the whistle on some seriously shady business within the Catholic Church? Well, this is some people's theory. He was deep in the trenches of one of the biggest scandals in church history. In 1996, he got involved with an activist group called Roman Catholic Faithful, the RCF, dedicated to exposing corruption within the clergy, and trust me, they were not here to play. Stephen Brady, the founder of RCF, was on a mission to clean house, but he needed someone who actually knew the church's legal system and knew it really well. Father John Hardin, who, by the way, is up for sainthood, told Brady that he needed Father Coons. He was the best and most knowledgeable in the field, and Coons was all in. Coons, Brady, and his ride or die, Father Charles Fiore, hit up the streets to investigate some pretty dark accusations. They were digging into Bishop Daniel Ryan of Springfield, Illinois, who, as it turns out, had some major skeletons in his closet. Word on the street, literally, was that Ryan had sexual relationships with male prostitutes and clergy members. But here's where it gets dark. One of the sex workers Coons and Fiore interviewed had a list of young boys who had allegedly been involved with Ryan. 4 out of those 5 boys already in prison. And guess what? All their stories lined up. So naturally, Coons and Fiore tried to take this to church higher-ups, and how did they respond? Well, they didn't. They were in total cover-up mode, and that's when Coons and Fiore decided to take matters into their own hands and hold a press conference. From there, the floodgates opened. They started getting calls from victims all over the country, desperate for someone, anyone, to listen to them. And it didn't stop there. Father Coons and Father Fiore were said to be working on compiling a list of abusive priests, gathering evidence and preparing to present it in Rome. Now, the rumor mill claims that Father Coons was planning to hand over the list to authorities, or even bolder, perhaps read it on his radio show. And can you imagine the fallout if that really happened? Peter Kelly, Coons' co-host, later said the list was real, but that Coons never intended to air it publicly. Still, that didn't stop people from whispering that he was silenced before he could blow the whistle. And with the church's reputation already hanging by a thread in the late 90s, that's when my grandmother left. She said, what the fuck is going on? What are they hiding? Absolutely not. Some believe powerful figures within the clergy wanted Coons dead before he could expose them. Bishop Daniel Ryan was definitely looked at as a person of interest. I mean, he had a motive. This guy's entire career was about to be torched if Coons went public. But despite rumors flying left and right, no hard evidence ever directly tied Ryan or any high-ranking church officials to the murder. Detectives did try to speak with Ryan, and Brady later claimed Coons had confided in him about the threats he was receiving, but again, nothing solid ever came from it. So, what if Coons wasn't taken down by some shadowy Vatican hit squad, but by someone closer to home? The fact that there were no signs of forced entry made police consider whether it was an inside job. Coons knew his killer. Let them in, and it got ugly. One name that kept coming up was parishioner Maureen Schultheus, the school principal, who Coons chose to take over the school upon the departure of the nuns. She reportedly discouraged cooperation with law enforcement after Coons' death. She handled Coons' estate after he died, which raised a few eyebrows as well, and there were rumors that she wanted the whole thing buried, especially after rumors about Coons' personal life started bubbling up. Police also considered whether someone at the school or in the parish had their own reasons for wanting Father Coons gone, whether it was personal, financial, or something else entirely. One more suspicious thing about Maureen, remember how there was evidence that Father Coons was on the phone shortly before his death? Investigators wanted to figure out who that call might have been to, so they tried to look at his Rolodex. Remember, this is the days before cell phones, and calls were a lot harder to trace. But as it turns out, the first cops on the scene made the incredible mistake of letting Maureen take the Rolodex. No direct evidence ever linked her to the murder, so when police tried to dig deeper, Maureen shut it down, refusing to talk. And DNA evidence from the crime scene didn't match any known insiders. And then there's this theory. Father Coons might have been known for his old school Catholicism and strict moral code, but apparently celibacy wasn't always his strongest suit. Rumors started flying that Coons had multiple sexual relationships with female parishioners, including some married women and newly divorced women, and at least 2 women admitted to having affairs with him, saying it all started with counseling and then it got personal and then, well, you get it. One of the biggest whispers was that Father Coons was involved with Maureen herself. She wasn't talking, though, and that made people wonder. Was his murder a crime of passion? Did a jealous husband, boyfriend, or jilted lover take matters into their own hands? Or was it someone trying to stop more scandal from coming out? With a small town like Dane, where everybody knew everybody's business, it wasn't hard to imagine someone snapping. Unfortunately, with no concrete leads and no one willing to talk, this theory remains just that, a theory. But do you guys remember Mora, the military waitress with a lot to say about Father Coons? If you're thinking she might have been one of the women involved with him, think again. She'll shut that down real fast. To Mora, Father Coons was a saint among men who could do no wrong. He loved everyone, and according to her, he was definitely not out here breaking his vows. But the morning she heard about Father Coons' murder, she collapsed in Lifetime movie fashion. Okay, like straight up fainted. People in town said Mora might have been a little too involved, always talking about Father Coons and inserting herself into the case. And she had visions, like literal premonitions. According to Mora, the day before Coons' murder, she felt something bad was coming. But what could she do? Nothing, apparently. She told police that Coons had been off that day, like he knew something was up. But investigators wanted to look into her being a little off that day. So the morning of the murder, Mora had dropped her kids off at the babysitter's house in her military uniform, which later mysteriously disappeared when police came looking for it. When they asked her about it, she brushed it off, just sort of like, oh, yeah, I got rid of it. And they even interviewed her kids, and one of them drew a picture of a military knife, like the one that could have slit a throat to the point of decapitation. Dawn Johnson, one of the lead detectives at the start of the case, later said she saw a drawing of a knife just like it on Mora's fridge. Still, Mora stood her ground. She insisted she had nothing to hide, and she was just a loyal patriot being unfairly targeted. "You're welcome for my service," she said. She literally said that in one of the rambling interviews that she gave. And according to Mora, Coons had told her that he was getting threatening letters warning him to keep his mouth shut. Apparently, he even showed her a couple of them, pulling them out of his desk drawer one day. They were official looking with wax seals, and they were ominous, basically telling Father Coons this was his last and final warning. Mora claims the police never found these letters after his murder because they were probably stolen, but Dawn Johnson claims that's a news story she definitely hasn't heard before. Basically, she thought Mora was making it up for attention. And let's be real, Mora definitely kept putting herself into the middle of the investigation. She offered up a lot of theories, she made herself way too available to the cops, and at one point, Dawn even hired her as a psychic just to humor her and see if she'd slip up. Dawn took Mora to St. Michael's to feel the energy. And you know what? Mora actually pointed out a few weird things. Like she somehow knew about loud talking, the radio that night that had been on, and a red light in the closet where Kunz's body was found. Could she actually be psychic, or was she just absorbing all of the local gossip? Mora had a complex relationship with the church. She was bisexual and is now married to a woman, which Father Coons apparently forgave her for after she confessed to him. Was she still struggling with this part of herself? Did it create some kind of internal conflict between her and Father Coons that tipped her over the edge? Investigators looked into that possibility, that she had snapped over it, but once again, the DNA just didn't match and there was nothing that concretely tied her to the murder scene. But Mora's connection to the case led them to another key suspect. Now, this guy, Len Snowden, was a tattoo artist, biker, knife collector, and, let's be honest, a walking red flag to authorities. Mora told police that she had slept with him in exchange for a free tattoo, which, can't blame her, and then confessed the whole thing to Father Coons after she started to feel guilty about it. Father told her to stay away from the likes of Snowden, and she did. According to Mora, Snowden asked her to leave the country with him, and when she refused his advances, he snapped. She claims that after Father Kunz's murder, he asked her again, saying, "How about now?" But Snowden says that's false. He denied all of it. He admitted to hooking up with Mora, but he swore he wasn't that into her. Police were super interested in Snowden, and honestly, can you blame them? The guy was quirky to say the least. He had a whole menagerie, talking birds, a pet squirrel that actually bit an investigator during questioning. Imagine trying to solve a murder while fending off a house rodent. But beyond his questionable choice in pets, which I don't blame him for, we love animals over here. Snowden was a known knife collector and always had a leather knife sheath strapped to his belt like he was some kind of backwards action hero. But when detectives asked him to hand over his knife, he pulled out a tiny red Swiss Army knife, the kind with like the little scissors and the corkscrew. But the problem is, everyone else, including his landlord, Donna O'Malley, swore up and down that Snowden usually carried a much bigger knife, a folding buck knife, which could definitely do some serious damage. But here's where it gets weird. Donna O'Malley, as soon as she tells her story, she flips it, saying, "Oh, no, actually, I've never seen him with a buck knife. I've never seen a knife in my life before." And then she ghosted the cops, refused to talk to them ever again, and that alone is suspicious. But detectives weren't buying it, so they confiscated 3 knives from Snowden, and they tested all of them, but dun dun dun, none matched the murder weapon. It was like just hitting dead end after dead end. And then there's Mora still, right? Our girl had a lot to say about Snowden. She told police she noticed cuts on his face right after Father Coons was murdered, which made him obviously look super sketchy, but when it came down to hard evidence, there was nothing. They took Snowden's DNA, they ran it against the evidence from the crime scene, and drumroll, please, it didn't match. No DNA, no matching knife, and his alibi, working at his tattoo shop that day, kind of checked out. With no real evidence to pin him, Snowden walked free, leaving cops frustrated and probably still scarred by that squirrel bite. One outlier, Randall Stocks, who also goes by Ryan St. Anne Scott, a self-proclaimed priest with a shady past, a weird obsession with very young nuns, and a firm belief that Father Coons' murder was an inside job. Stocks, we'll call him that for now, ran a bizarre religious group with some seriously sketchy practices. His church allegedly had 11-year-old nuns, children dressed as nuns, which is a big red flag. And if that's not enough to make you side-eye this dude, let's talk about his adoption. When he was 50 years old, an elderly woman legally adopted him, not in a sweet, "I never had a son" way kind of way, but in a "I'm giving you control of my assets" kind of way. And that arrangement didn't work out too well for her because Stocks was later charged with financial exploitation. Stocks, or Ryan, or whatever he's calling himself these days, is convinced that Father Coons' murder wasn't random at all. No, he believes it was a carefully calculated hit orchestrated by the Catholic Church itself. One more person of interest in Father Coons' murder was Jeffrey Moss, a religious zealot and self-proclaimed shrine keeper with ties to the Queen of the Holy Rosary Shrine in Necedah, Wisconsin, a place known for its interesting mix of apocalyptic prophecies and Marian apparitions. He became a person of interest in Father Alfred Kunz's murder case thanks to his erratic behavior, extremist beliefs, and his connection to St. Michael's Church. Now, again, here's where it gets a little weird. St. Michael's, where Father Coons was murdered, was one of the very few churches that actually welcomed members of the Necedah Shrine community. This group, which was founded by Mary Ann Van Hoof, who claimed to have seen the Virgin Mary in her backyard, by the way. Jeffrey, deep in the thick of it, saw Father Coons as an ally in his mission to preserve the true Catholic faith. He wasn't just preaching some doomsday talk, he was preparing for it. In the months leading up to Father Coons' murder, several Catholic churches in the area, including St. Michael's, started noticing religious artifacts had gone missing. We're talking statues, vestments, chalices, the works. Suspicion eventually landed on Jeffrey Moss, and when police finally caught up with him, they found a whole survivalist hoarder's dream, including those stolen items, hidden in makeshift bunkers buried under piles of branches near the shrine. Think canned goods, rifles, church relics, and enough oatmeal to last through Judgment Day. Jeffrey Moss was fully convinced that an impending apocalypse would require him to step in and rebuild the Catholic Church from scratch. Talk about being overprepared. Witnesses also reported Jeffrey Moss acting even weirder than usual leading up to Coons' murder. He was reportedly stockpiling supplies at a frantic pace and muttering about an impending reckoning. This tipped off police, who then decided to pay him a visit, and when they searched his bunker, they found everything but a direct link to the murder of Father Alfred Coons. Plus, Jeffrey had an alibi for the night of Coons' death. He claimed he was with a friend, Brother Francis King, another shrine devotee. King backed up Moss's story, but the whole thing felt off. Investigators remained skeptical because, let's face it, Moss was not the most trustworthy source. But when they checked his DNA against evidence taken from the crime scene, there was nothing. No match. Theories swirled, of course. Some people speculated that Jeffrey felt betrayed by Coons for not going all in on the apocalyptic train, and so he took matters into his own hands. Others thought maybe he saw Father Coons as too soft on sinners and thought he needed to be purified. Whatever his motivations, the guy was obsessed with Father Coons and the church as a whole. But let's be real. Moss was already on another level. He had a history of paranoia, believing that communists were plotting to burn down the Catholic churches and that any day now the world was coming to an end, okay? His obsession with relics and doomsday prepping made him an easy target for suspicion, but police could never actually pin anything on him. And eventually, Moss passed away, taking any secrets he might have had to the grave. But to this day, some people think he knew way more than he let on, while others believe he was just an eccentric hoarder caught up in the bizarre chaos surrounding Father Kunz's murder. But either way, he remains one of the case's most memorable suspects, whether he did it or not. On March 3rd, 2018, Father John Zulsdorf, aka Father Z to his blog followers, celebrated a solemn mass for Father Kunz's soul at St. Mary of Pine Bluff Catholic Church. It had been about 20 years since Kunz was found murdered in the hallway of St. Michael's School, and the mystery surrounding his death still haunted the small town of Dane, Wisconsin. March 4th, 2018 marked the official 20th anniversary of the murder, and the Dane County Sheriff's Department decided to go all in with a huge push to finally crack the case. They put out press releases, ramped up their social media game, and basically blasted justice for Father Kunz across every platform they could think of. And the strategy worked, big time. Within days, their phones were blowing up. The sheriff's office was flooded with tips from the public, like so many calls that they actually had a dedicated team working full-time on the case for the next 4 months. And then, boom, that DNA we've been referencing. Thanks to advances in forensic tech, investigators decided to retest some of the evidence from the crime scene and, well, it paid off. They were able to develop a partial DNA profile, but before you get too excited, here's the catch with partial profiles. They're not a magic bullet. Since it's not a full DNA sequence, it's basically useless unless you have a specific person to test it against. In other words, if the person who left it isn't already in the system, it's just sitting there waiting for a match. Still, it was a huge step forward. The DNA ruled out every major suspect law enforcement had previously looked at, all the ones we just talked about, including Kunz's close associates, school staff, and the more colorful characters connected to the case. This means whoever did it was either really off the radar, or they haven't been caught for anything else. Yet, law enforcement is still actively investigating. They're banking on future technological advancements, think familial DNA searches, genealogy tracking, or even some random arrest that leads to a match. Basically, they're playing the long game, waiting for science and luck to do its thing. So, what's next? Well, that's the million-dollar question. All we can do is sit back, keep an eye on those cold case updates, and see if Father Kunz's killer finally gets caught. Because, as they say, justice may be delayed, but it's never denied. Or at least that's what we always hope. I know that was a lot, and I hope it made sense. I'm sorry if I missed anything, jumped around too much, confused anyone, butchered a Wisconsin town. We got a lot of characters, so I did my best to break it down into hopefully digestible parts, and hopefully you got it. So what do we think? Who done it? Apparently no one that was previously connected to the case. If anyone wants to watch or see these characters' voices or interview, please look them up. It's worth it. We've got wild characters here. But that's where we're going to leave it for the week. I will see you next time. And until next time, hopefully it doesn't take another neck getting laced before they solve this old cold case. Goodbye.